Yeah, today I'm going to present to you this preprint that we have out now called The Entropy of Resting State Neural Dynamics as a Marker of General Cognitive Ability in Childhood. So today's talk will introduce the idea of ICNs, or intrinsic connectivity networks. We're going to talk a little bit about what we mean about neural dynamics, how we analyze them, and I'll get into the details of this specific study. I'll talk a bit about our methods. We're using a hidden Markov modeling approach, so that should be interesting. And then I'll discuss our results and conclusions. So let's begin. So many of you will have heard of intrinsic connectivity networks. Here are some of them displayed on the screen. They're obviously more depending on how you choose to parcel them out. And basically what they are, they're neural populations that fire synchronously and exhibit a spatial pattern of activity across time. So you see the same networks firing together in a sequence, and you can observe these in both task settings and also in the resting state case. They're modulated by sensory inputs, but they exist as intrinsic components of functional brain organization, and they actually appear really early on in development, suggesting that they're for something specific. They change throughout life and become more modularized in a way that optimizes for certain types of cognition and behavior. So this is really, really key to kind of keep in mind as I discuss our analysis and our results. As for the relationship between these intrinsic networks and neurodevelopment, across neurodevelopment we see global changes in the brain in segregation and integration balance between these key networks. So over time, ICNs become more modular, and there are also differences in functional connectivity between ICNs in a way that, as I said, seems to optimize for some kind of performance. And there's also a hierarchical order of development from primary to higher order regions. So the first ICNs to modularize and strengthen are the kind of sensory motor ones, and then you work up to the more complex frontal networks, sort of finishing off their development in your mid-20s. And divergent ICN development has actually been noticed a lot in various conditions, including neurodevelopmental conditions. So these are three of the intrinsic connectivity networks that are most implicated: the default mode network, the salience network, and the central executive network. So over time, there's usually a growing anti-correlation between activity in the default mode network areas and areas implicated in the central executive network. But if there's a higher correlation between firing in these two networks, there's a higher likelihood that a person will experience things like executive dysfunction, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and other features of neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD. So it seems like the default mode network in particular is a really kind of key feature we should be looking at when trying to understand the emergence of these neurodevelopmental conditions that affect areas of cognition and behavior. And this is often referred to as the triple network model of neurodevelopmental psychopathology, developed in, I think, 2011. Great. And in this talk, I'm going to be describing our results concerning neural dynamics. So I thought here would be a good idea to talk to you a little bit about what we mean by that, and also why this is different from the typical types of measures that we have when we take, for instance, an fMRI scan or any other kind of resting state scan. So neural dynamics aren't just correlations and anti-correlations between levels of activity in different parts of the brain, right? They're not just kind of a co-activation matrix that's been averaged across time. Neural dynamics add the dimension of time, and they allow us to ask certain questions about things like the order in which dynamical switching between brain states occurs, which I'm going to refer to as state transition probabilities, the duration of each dynamical state or pattern of activity, if you like, which is summarized in the measures of state lifetimes and fractional occupancies, and also the length of time it takes to return to a particular state, which here I'll call a state interval. And MEG is really great because it allows us to capture this temporal component with really, really good resolution. And previous work has identified transient network states at 100 millisecond timescales, or even smaller timescales than that. So that's really wonderful, and that's kind of why this method allowed us to be able to do this type of study. So in this study, we wanted to understand how rapid whole brain processes at rest vary with measures of behavior and cognition in children. And the reason that we're so interested in this is because it can inform our understanding of neurodevelopmental divergence past what we're just able to learn from structural or time-averaged functional network analyses that, for instance, have been done in my lab in previous years. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the methods. This is our sample. So we decided to combine two developmental samples here, the Resilience in Education and Development sample and the Center for Attention, Learning, and Memory. And in both cases, our participants were aged 8 to 13. We already had a lot of scans from the red cohort, but we re-recruited some from the calm cohort, and I'll tell you why. So red kids were not recruited based on neurodevelopmental difficulties. The idea of that studies was to have a very population representative distribution of various traits. However, calm was recruited on the basis of having difficulties at school, difficulties at home, or on the basis of seeing a speech and language therapist. And so we decided to essentially bulk out the upper tail of our distribution for certain traits like high levels of inattention and hyperactivity. And we actually recruited on that basis because we really wanted to know what neural dynamics might be like in that kind of upper limit of the inattention hyperactivity spectrum. So following outlier exclusions, we had 40 participants from red and 6 from calm that we managed to recruit for a full sample of 46 people. And here are just some characteristics. So you can see here that things like age, cognitive ability, et cetera, are pretty normally distributed. Our sample was about half male, half female. But you can see here for the strengths and difficulties questionnaire that that higher end of the distribution is a little bit fat-tailed, which is essentially what we wanted. We wanted kind of a finer-grained representation of what it might be like to experience a high degree of these traits. And each of the children in this study received a 10-minute resting state MEG scan here at the CBU. And we also administered a Wechsler Abbreviated Scales of Intelligence 2 test, which is a general test of cognitive ability, as well as the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire, which is a quick parent report questionnaire that addresses various elements of difficulty in behavior at school and at home. So I won't talk about this very much because if you really want to know about our pre-processing pipeline, you can read our preprint. But this is sort of the path that we took to reaching the point where we could actually feed our resting state data into the hidden Markov model. You can see here it's quite a lengthy process. There are reasons for all of these steps. Yeah, if you're interested, please read on. Right, so eventually, once we were finished with pre-processing, we got to the stage where we could pass all of our data into a hidden Markov model. So what is that? Well, with a hidden Markov model, we assume that data observations are generated by a series of hidden states, which are organized in a chain. Our data observations in this case are just the time series data from our MEG scans. And we're assuming there's kind of this generative model thing happening where these hidden states are acting as latent factors for our observations. And our goal with a hidden Markov model is to be able to describe what these states might be. And in this case, we built a Gaussian observation model for each state. So the idea is you specify a number of states that your model can contain. We ran a ton of different models ranging from 4 to 14 states, but we've stuck with a 7-state representation. And you can see here kind of how the states are inferred from a time series. So we assume here that the variance for each of these mutually exclusive kind of consecutively occurring states is described by a Gaussian distribution, and that they recur in time. And yeah, another really important assumption is that they are temporally discrete. So there's no overlap in states, but if we're just talking about the neural elements of each state, there can be overlap. So some states contain the same neural features as other states, even though we're assuming here in our model that they're not crossing over across time. And the reason we chose hidden Markov modeling was because the relevant timescales for the states are learned directly from the data. We're estimating adaptive state visits or windows in a very data-driven manner. So we get to make fewer assumptions, basically. And it makes it possible to identify dynamic brain networks in neuroimaging data at really tiny timescales. So as I discussed before, it's possible to infer these states at less than 100 millisecond timescales. And we can also witness that transitions between the network states are organized in a neat hierarchical way, or at least in a way that might lead to some insights into cognition and behavior. So I'll give you some idea of our results in the next few slides. These were the states that we managed to extract, so it was actually really neat as a demonstration of concept. This was sort of the first developmental study of its kind, so we were really pleased to see that a lot of major ICNs are represented in our state model. We have a very strong default mode activation and suppression set of states, state 1 and state 3. We've got visual state, and then a lot of states that represent various features of different ICNs, like frontoparietal activation and visual suppression state, and so on. So basically, in our distribution of states, the reason that we chose the 7-state representation is because we wanted to minimize redundancy in the spatial, the sort of like the brain representation of which states were included in our model. But we also didn't want to fragment out the states too much. We didn't want to have states that were spatio-temporally fragmented such that we weren't able to represent ICNs that well anymore. Great. And as you can see here, we were able to extract a time course of a Viterbi path for each participant representing how they switched between the states. So all those switches you see up in the upper right-hand corner are actually taking place over 1,000 time steps, which here is just 4 seconds. And from these joint posterior probabilities of states transitioning into one another, we were able to get state transition probability matrix for each participant, as well as a general one averaged across all of the participants' time courses. So we generated this digraph here representing how likely it is that you're going to be transitioning from one state to the next. And another interesting thing that we chose to do was to calculate an entropy rate for each participant based on their state transition probability matrix. So we have all these measures now for each of the states. And we decided to proceed with our analyses to compare features of the states to properties of cognition and behavior. And you can see here as well that the different states have different distributions for their fractional occupancies or how long they occupied the time course for each participant, as well as different intervals, so how long it takes to return to a state, and different lifetimes, how long you tend to spend in a state whenever you're in it. So first we were interested in testing whether there are relationships between cognitive ability and individual level properties of these states. So we performed all these general linear model analyses with an FDR correction, basically taking into account confounds like age, gender, and then specifically looking at these WASI-2 T-scores. Okay. And then we were also interested in behavior, and we performed similar analyses to this effect. One thing I should mention here is we didn't find any significant relationships between state measures and behavior, so I'm going to just focus on our cognitive results here. So first, we found that cognitive ability is related to state switching and also the time course entropy rate for individual participants. And actually, these two measures of state switching, so how quickly you can transition between different states, and the time course entropy are highly related to one another, suggesting that entropy is something that, in our case, in our data set, emerges from rapid state switching and not, for instance, from this inherently kind of sort of stochastic pattern of switching. There's no real order to states that you transition between. It's more explained just kind of by how rapidly you're making these transitions. And we found a positive relationship between basically this entropy measure and cognitive ability. So that was really fascinating. And then we looked at whether or not cognition is related to the time spent in certain states, so the fractional occupancy. And what we found here is that in the case of more frontally distributed states, so kind of central executive network and salience network states, those states were positively correlated with cognitive ability, and the opposite was true of states largely representing the default mode network. So those were negatively correlated with measures of cognitive ability. And this is kind of in line with previous research concerning the triple network model of neurodevelopmental psychopathology. Again, cognition was also related to the probability of transitioning into certain states. Here we kind of have this matrix representing this relationship between WASI T-scores and state transition probabilities. And it should be clear to you that state 3, state 4, and state 6 are clearly the states with the strongest effect. And you can see on this diagram here as well, the arrows pointing into state 3 are negative, so negatively correlated with cognitive ability, and the opposite is true of arrows going into state 4 and state 6. And then we explored this a little further, and we basically found, again, that there's a negative association between this default mode state and cognitive ability, and positive associations between these largely frontoparietal states and cognitive ability. So I'll just wrap up here because I know we're short on time. We found that it's possible to use HMMs to extract discrete states that are interpretable as functional networks. And more importantly, this can be done in a developmental sample that includes individuals who are very inattentive and hyperactive. And if you're involved in neuroimaging, you might know already that it's hard to get anyone to sit still in a scanner, but for children with a lot of ADHD traits, this is especially, difficult is a very light way of putting it. So we were really pleased that we got these results and that they basically passed our sanity checks. Next, we found that entropy-related properties of participants' resting state time courses were positively associated with cognitive ability, which corroborates some previous findings that are emerging about the relationship between entropy and cognition across the lifespan. And then cognitive ability was also positively correlated with the probability of transitioning into and staying in frontoparietal and somatomotor activation states. But it was negatively associated with default mode network states. So again, this is really theoretically kind of aligned with previous theories about these intrinsic connectivity networks and features of cognition in childhood development. And alongside collaborators, we've actually been applying HMMs to new data sets, for instance, in preschoolers, and also with different components of the data that we have from the RED data set. So we're excited to share this work with you soon. We should have some papers coming out in the next year or so. I'm very thankful to all of my colleagues and collaborators and funders here at the MRC CBU.